Okay, so we're gonna switch gears and get into a different topic that is very hot right now. And it's important to clear the air because, it's something that people are claiming to be heavily rooted in Jewish thought and halakha. And both sides of the political spectrum are claiming, like, for example, on the abortion law, there are some who claim that on the left who would say that the Torah promotes, or there's room for the rabbis make exceptions for abortion, and then on the other side you have the right wingers who would say that no, actually the Torah is anti-abortion completely all the time. So everyone's kind of just bending the Torah to favor their opinion. What do you say? Obviously, I'm sure the true answer is somewhere in the middle, but can you give us a background on the history of abortion in Jewish thought?
Sure. So yes, I think the answer is to the question is that often neither side is correct, or they're not. It's not certainly the only view. The issue is a very complex one, and it's complex because it's complex even from a secular moral perspective, and then various religious traditions have different perspectives on it. The source, it's worth perhaps even introducing this by a comment. I was talking to someone this week about this issue, someone who was a fairly well-educated modern Orthodox Jew, who was surprised to learn in our discussion, and he wasn't taking a political stance, that we grew up, he and I, roughly the same age as I am, grew up knowing really only Ramosha Feinstein's opinion. And Ramosha, when I was growing up, was really the dominant voice, certainly in the United States, the Posei Kadar, and maybe still powered over anybody at the time in Eretz Yisrael, especially the Chazon Ish wasn't alive anymore. So I only knew of one opinion, that abortion was murder and it was only permitted to save the mother's life. I learned very quickly from some of my Rabbeim that was in fact not the only opinion. And this is something that seems not to be well known to a lot of from Jews, certainly modern Orthodox Jews, but I suspect all Orthodox Jews are, because Ramosha was such a towering figure, and Rav Soloveitchik also was even more machmir than Ramosha, at least from what almost everybody reports his opinion to be. So I think that the other approach sort of was not an approach that was heard. But let me start briefly with just talking about the source materials in Tanakh and in Chazal. The only passage in the Torah that deals with the question of feticide rather than abortion, I'll term it that, is the Psukim in Parshas Mishpat. The Torah there describes two scenarios, and one story and two possible outcomes. A man tries to kill his friend, taking a swing at him, misses, hits a pregnant woman. And the way Chazal read the text, and this is to harken back to not quite to our first half of our discussion, going back to academic Bible, there have been other interpretations other than the rabbinic one that exist in terms of what are the two scenarios. The Torah says, "V'lo yeh ason," or "im yeh ason." If there's no ason, it's yatsi yiladeh, she miscarries, "V'lo yeh ason," but the woman doesn't die, then you pay money to the father. However, im ason yeh, if the woman dies, v'nasata nefesh tachas nefesh, which is a machlokas, but the simple reading is the opinion of the Chachamim that you execute the person. Even though we tried to kill one person and kill the pregnant with someone else, you're still chayav misa, you're still liable for capital punishment. Now, there have been other interpretations advanced as to what it means, ason and no ason. Perhaps the most famous being the Septuagint, which distinguishes between whether the fetus was fully formed or not, whatever exactly that means. It happens to be that, aside from the fact that I am a rabbinic Jew and I have Masorah from my teachers and from Chazal, what it means, the Septuagint reading is wrong, fundamentally, because we know what the Torah meant, if only because of the parallel in ancient Near Eastern literature. I believe it's in the Code of Hammurabi, and maybe in one of the other law codes, in which the same scenario, two scenarios are described. The only difference is that you're striking someone's daughter. If she miscarries, you pay a fine. If she dies, you kill the guy's daughter, not him, which is what one of the hallmarks that distinguish ancient Near Eastern law from the Torah's, I'll call, moral revolution, that we don't punish people for the sins of others. Right. So it's very clear what the two scenarios were. The two scenarios were the mother dies, the mother doesn't die. But I don't need that for myself because we have Chazal's tradition, so I don't need more than that, and that's what Chazal told us, and so that in itself, that's sufficient. That's enough for me. Now, a number have pointed out, based upon the Psukim and Parshas Mishpatim and some of the Rishonim, that the simple implications that the fetus is not considered a life. Because if the fetus had been considered a life and feticide, even accidental, were an act of murder, the Torah would never allow financial compensation. There might or might not be the death penalty, but you would never pay money for it. One of the sort of hallmarks, another distinguishing hallmark of Torah law versus ancient Near Eastern law, is that the Torah places there's an infinite value on human life. No tselem elokim, the destruction of a tselem elokim can never be compensated for with money. And even when Chazal didn't like capital punishment, they never instituted a financial payment for killing somebody, because to take money for snuffing out a tselem elokim basically means that a human life, not human work, but human life can be equated with money, and that's anathema to the Torah's entire perspective that human beings and only human beings were created with tselem elokim. So a number of Rishonim, I think, already point this out, that the Psukim at least sound as if it's not an act of murder, because otherwise it would be, you wouldn't have a financial penalty. In Chazal itself, there are a number of sources that deal with the question of feticide. Most of them point in the direction that a fetus is not considered a life. The first one is a Mishnah in Alos. It's a very somewhat famous Mishnah. Most people probably don't realize it's in Alos. And the Mishnah, I think it's the end of the 7th chapter, says that if a woman is struggling in childbirth, Isha Makasha Leled, we dismember the fetus inside her in order to save her life, because her life takes precedence over its life. However, Yatsa Rubo, once a majority of the fetus or in a breech birth, or if the head, once the head comes out, ein nogenbo, she'ein docha nefesh nefesh. You cannot touch the fetus to save the mother, because you cannot kill one nefesh to save another nefesh. A large block of Rishonim, large block of the major Rishonim, all just observe based upon the text of the Mishnah that obviously a fetus, until it sticks its head out or a majority out, is not considered a nefesh. Because once it sticks its head out, ein docha nefesh b'nei nefesh. Before that point, you kill the fetus to save the mother because it's not a nefesh. So that Mishnah, read simply, would suggest that a fetus is not a nefesh. Secondly, there is a Mishnah in Arach that says that if a pregnant woman has been sentenced to death, you do not wait for her to give birth in order to let the fetus be born. And the Gemara, commenting on that part of the Mishnah, says, Pshita gufay, it's just a part of her body. Why would you wait? There's a second part of the Mishnah which says that Yashva Lamashber, once she's sitting on the birthing stool, which I think usually refers to full dilation, then you wait for her to give birth, and then you execute her. So this too, and I should add one other point, the Shmuel in the Gemara says that before you execute the pregnant woman, meaning the one who's hasn't gone into end-stage labor, you actually beat your makin keneged beis haryona. You kill the fetus actively, not just that you execute her and then the fetus, as a side effect, dies. You actually pound away opposite the uterus in order to kill the fetus before you execute her. There's a reason, whatever reason, to make the execution less unpleasant. We need to explain that right now. But literally, it's not just that you kill the woman, you deliberately go and you kill the fetus. So all of these sources point in the direction of the fact that a fetus is not a life, and therefore killing a fetus is not murder. Now, we still have to talk about under what is there a prohibition, what would the prohibition be, and in what circumstances would we be permitted to violate, or to set it aside, would be a better way of formulating it. Now, there are two sources that suggest the opposite, that in fact, killing a fetus is an act of murder. The first is a passage in Sanhedrin, the Gemara Sanhedrin, in the 7th parak, which states, according to one opinion, a lot of people forget that there is another opinion, but one opinion says, Tana de Rabbi Shmuel says that a ben Noach, a Noachide, a non-Jew, is killed, is executed for murder over a fetus, is nerag al bar. And if feticide were not murder, then the question would be, why would he be liable to the death penalty? And there have been interpretations offered to explain why, but the verse, the proof text that the Gemara cites, is from the pasuk in Parshas Noach that talks about murder. Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech. and they read it as shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam, one who spills the blood of a person in a person, adam ba'adam, and that's a fetus. So it certainly sounds like it's an act of murder for Noahide. And then the other very interesting passage is from that same Gemara in Arachin. I should say Erchin is the way most people pronounce it. I apologize for my hyper-correct pronunciation. So the Gemara in Erchin says that if a pregnant woman, not one who was sentenced to death, pregnant woman in good standing dies on Shabbos, you can bring a knife carried through the Rishus HaRabim to cut her open to save the fetus. So if a fetus is not considered a life, not a nefesh, why can you desecrate the Shabbos? Why can you be Michal Shabbos? It's not pikuach nefesh. That's the other source that might point in the direction of the fetus being a life. Now, I'm not going to go further. I want to spend all night on this. We could probably talk for a very long time. But what emerges in the contemporary period, when elective abortion becomes much more easily elective abortion has existed for a long time, but it's gotten much safer. And we have sort of a whole set of reasons why people might want to terminate a pregnancy that never existed till 50 years ago, which is fetal defects. I mean, they existed, we just had no way of knowing. So nobody was gonna terminate a pregnancy when they had no clue that the fetus actually was carrying had some genes that would cause terrible suffering. So in the contemporary period, there are two thoughts amongst the poskim. I'm not going to name names because in some cases they've chosen not to write their tshuvos. But of those written tshuvos, the two people who represent the two opinions were Ramosha Feinstein Zal, as I mentioned before, who held that feticide was considered murder for Jews and non-Jews, and it was only permitted to save the life of the mother. And the position of the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, who was a little younger than Ramosha, who was the posek for Sharei Tzedek in Israel. And he ruled that killing a fetus was only an act of chavala, of wounding, and therefore it would have been permissible. Well, and he permitted terminating the pregnancy with a Tay-Sachs baby. But in principle, if you believe that the only prohibition that's involved in terminating a pregnancy, an abortion, is chavala, is wounding, so that really opens the door to a whole broad set of circumstances in which it might be justified to violate the prohibition. And it's important to note most negative commandments, most isurei lavim in the Torah, it really doesn't make a difference whether what the reason you want to violate it is. There's only one circumstance in which you're allowed to violate normally a negative commandment, which is danger to life. You can only desecrate the Shabbos. You can only eat non-kosher food if your life is in danger. But the prohibition of wounding is an unusual prohibition because baked into its definition is it has to be destructive by its nature. Large numbers of poskim permit elective plastic surgery, even though you're wounding yourself in the process. You're letting them wound you because the purpose is constructive. It has to be done, a derech nitzayon, I think is the Rambam's formula. It has to be in a destructive, vengeful manner. But if it's being done for what we call a productive purpose, then it's not considered a violation of Chavala anymore. And it's for that reason that there are, I would say it's not just many, I think most of the people who are answering these questions and getting these questions today in the year 2022, most of the people answering the questions treat the Tzitz Eliezer's position as correct. They think Ramosha's position is a minority position, even though he was the dominant voice undoubtedly in the previous generation, and they will permit in a whole broad range of circumstances. I know from my own personal experience of going to one of the major poskim of today, I know he's not alone, is permitting terminations of pregnancies in situations of fetal defects, in situations of maternal health where there's no danger to the mother's life, and in situations of a single woman where in our community, in the Orthodox community, there's a lot of social stigma associated with single women being pregnant. So I have brought all of those cases in which the posek was not here, and this person is not alone. I believe it's the dominant position in the Orthodox community today, even though Ramosha's position 50 years ago certainly seemed to have been, for many people's minds, it was the only position, but the facts on the ground are not that way anymore. So there really are two legitimate positions in Psak Halacha, one which regards abortion as murder, which was Ramosha's position, and the other is regards abortion, at least for Jews. And I don't want to really go into that question, how you can make any distinction, but if we're talking about in our community, our poskim, what a frum Jew goes to his Rav or her Rav and asks a Shaila. So the position, I think the dominant contemporary position that the prohibition is Chavala, and there's a much broader range of circumstances than just danger to the mother's life, in which they will permit terminated pregnancy. I think it's worth at least emphasizing two things in this. Number one, it's not a decision that's taken lightly. There is, I mentioned before, maybe it's worth just exploring it a little bit because it's a really interesting Ramban and Tosfos. I mentioned before, the Gemara says that you can carry a knife, you can desecrate the Shabbos, carry a knife to the public domain to cut open a woman who died to try to save the fetus. And the question is, if the fetus is not a life, how are you allowed to do that? So Tosfos and the Ramban together really pose two different answers. One answer is that the fetus is not a life as long as the mother is alive. But because the fetus is drawing its nourishment from the mother. But once the mother has died, then if the fetus is still alive, it's an independent life because it's clearly not drawing any sustenance from the mother, so it's its own life. So that's why you can desecrate the Shabbos, because if the fetus might be alive, it is obviously a life now. The second answer, though, is the much more interesting answer. The way the Ramban formulates it is that it's true. The fetus is not a life, and there is no pikuach nefesh here, because it's not a nefesh. But the Ramban points out that one of the sources that the Gemara and Yoma presents for desecrating the Shabbos to save life is chalal alav Shabbos achas kedei sheyishmar Shabbosos harbe. You desecrate one Shabbos so that this individual will be able to keep many Shabbos. So the Ramban says if this fetus is ultimately born and survives, it will keep Shabbos. Therefore, even though it's not a life yet, you can still apply the principle of chalal alav Shabbos achas kedei sheyishmar Shabbosos harbe, which tells us that even if the fetus is not life, it's a potential life, and that's not something we take lightly. That's point number one, is that even the poskim who permit terminating the pregnancy in a broader range of circumstances, it's not a decision taken lightly. There's a sensitivity to life that has to be there throughout. The second point, and this is just my assumption, I've never had this case, is that one circumstance in which I don't think a posek would permit terminated pregnancy would be for economic reasons. A family that's struggling financially, they would not permit it. And the reason they wouldn't permit it is because the appropriate response of the Rav, of the posek, when faced with such a circumstance of a family that wants to terminate a pregnancy because of financial reasons, is to make sure the community provides the funds to raise that child. It's unconscionable in any society, Jewish or otherwise, that a woman or a family should choose to terminate a pregnancy because they can't afford to raise that child. That's morally unacceptable, and that's why I think I've never had this case be brought. Partially, I think because many people, I think most from Jews wouldn't really, they would sort of intuitively sense that financial reasons is not a reason to terminate a pregnancy. But if the shaila, if someone was really struggling and it's legitimate to ask the question, I think the appropriate response, I think the response of the posek would be, we'll find the funds so you can have this child and raise this child. So I think those 2 points need to be kept in mind, even for the so-called lenient camp.
Very, very informative. And I think, the problem is that today with the way politics are, you have to kind of pick a side. It's tribalism, and it's very extreme. There's no room for nuance. And the thing is, people, because we're in a quote unquote Judeo-Christian country, people conflate Judaism with Catholicism, and we don't see things black and white the way they do. We're not against contraceptives. We're not against, right? So I think there is a danger of just always siding with, the Christian view. As for a Jewish listener who is not very well informed, I want to point this out. But I do have one question because
may I, Ben, I just want to comment on one thing though. I would push back a little bit. I know some people may sound like that. I think the real problem is that Jews don't identify with Christianity. There are Jews who identify with either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party.
Right.
Whereas opposed to, I've said this in a sermon once. I said, I vote however I vote, but if I'm going to belong to a party, I'm going to belong to the party of God. Now, that's a little bad because that's what Hezbollah means. But the point is that no Jew, a Jew can vote. You vote however you want. You make your calculations. No Torah Jew should see himself at his core that he's a Democrat or a Republican, because neither party's views reflect Torah values in their totality. In fact, most of the time, I hardly say in so many ways. So I think that a lot of look, Jews who think, Orthodox Jews who think that abortion is murder, and it's the only position in Judaism, there are two reasons, one which is good and one which is bad. One, I think, is, I spoke about my experience, is if you grew up in a time when Moshe was the towering giant, you didn't know there was another, you might not have known there was another opinion. Secondly, is because the Orthodox community has much more largely shifted politically right, there is this identification with, I'll call it the Republican position, which is the Catholic position and more recently the evangelical position, although it's true on the other side as well, and not so much in Orthodoxy, although you'll encounter it, but in the liberal denominations, the exact same thing has happened, which is, whatever the contemporary liberal ethos is in America, that's what Torah values are in those communities, and I find them to be both equally problematic.
Well said. And the last thing I wanted to ask, because I keep hearing it being used as like one of the prime examples that, like, what about rape situations or incest situations? And if you look at the Torah, you see that women were given the opportunity to marry their rapist because it would, protect them in the ancient world, because otherwise they would maybe have to turn to harlotry or who knows what. And this was a way of preserving her dignity and so on and so forth. But the Torah didn't have solutions to like the problem. We have modern solutions to these problems. So obviously the Torah is addressing, something that was happening back then, which is different today. So how would we look at it now?
So I have to admit, this is, most people, if you've ever read Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind, and I highly recommend people read it. So most people reach their moral conclusions, their values conclusions on these issues with their gut as opposed to their brain. It may be a big come down for people who like to see themselves as intellectuals, but it's actually a good thing because Haidt describes, he said, someone who makes their moral values purely with no emotional input is actually a sociopath. That's a description of what it turns out to be. But I think that this is a wonderful example of where, people don't want to take the logical conclusions of their position. If you believe that abortion is murder, and I must stress, there is a legitimate stream within our tradition that thinks that. Even if it's not the majority position being ruled on now, I think you cannot negate it or dismiss it. If you believe that it is murder, you are hard-pressed to explain why you would permit terminating a pregnancy in the case of rape or incest, because the bottom line is the fetus didn't do anything wrong. The only circumstances in which you might, a posek who would adopt Moshe's position might be able to argue it's permitted, is if it represented a danger to the mother's life because of mental health issues. I find that line of reasoning, though, to be not compelling, because if you are concerned that, firstly, there are lots and lots of women in this world, much outside the United States, in horrible circumstances, who've been raped in wars in Africa, who wind up having children that way, they're not killing themselves. The way you deal with suicidal ideation is with proper treatment. If the only treatment were terminating the pregnancy, then yeah, I think a posek would say that it's permissible, but there usually are other ways of dealing with it. It's not just saying, well, your life would be terrible, you're right, and if things were born and we ignored you, you would kill yourself, so we'll permit you to terminate the pregnancy. No, if you really believe that it's murder, then the answer is you provide the emotional support, the psychological support, unless that you feel that will be insufficient. Obviously, this is the kind of case that makes people on the political right or on the abortion is murder camp squirm. It makes them squirm because obviously it's heart-wrenching, it's terrible, right? Nobody will disagree that it's a horrible outcome. The question is, do you kill a human being just because the mother has had a terrible thing happen to her? Right? Just imagine the child were born. And now the question is, can you commit infanticide because the psychological damage to the mother is so horrible, having this child, which every day she sees the child reminds of her rapist or the incest? So I think we all know the answer to that question is absolutely not. That's full-fledged murder. So if you believe that in utero, it's already a life, a full-fledged life, unless the mother's life is in danger, the only logical conclusion is that you should not permit terminating the pregnancy. Now, if I've never had this particular question, but I am sure the poskim who are lenient in the circumstances I described would be lenient as well in the case of incest and rape. But if you adopt Moshe's position, the only logical outcome is that it's horrible, but bad things happen. It doesn't give you a right to kill someone in the process. that makes, as I said, many people on the right uncomfortable, because the optics, if your issues are decided based upon emotions and who can score, the best photo op, or its equivalent in this case, of what tugs at people's emotional heartstrings, then it's a really, really hard case to deal with. This was this case in Indiana, right, of the doctor who properly reported to the authorities, and who performed the termination. But the truth is, as uncomfortable as it may make people on the political right, if you believe that it's murder, if that's your basis, I mean, you could have other reasons why you want to oppose abortion, but I'll give you the most favorable interpretation, which is you're really interested in protecting human life. Well, it's a human life, and you don't get the right to kill it just because it came about under horrible circumstances. So,
okay, thank you so much for that. Really, very informative shiur, and hopefully we'll get to share it with your contacts as well. And hope to see you again one day on the podcast.
thank you for having me. It's a pleasure talking.
Pleasure.